All right, in this unit, we're going to cover the lipids. Lipids is a catch-all name for all of our fats, our oils, our sterile compounds, which include our sex hormones like testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, cholesterol, and our phospholipids. So often we tend to refer to these as our fats, and I myself am guilty of this too. I often talk about them in terms of fats, but fats is actually a little bit more specific term in referring to lipids. So work to keep that straight. The fats and oils are slightly different, and we'll talk about how those are different, but all of them come under this group of lipids. As we saw with carbohydrates, they have the same basic elemental makeup as our carbs. They're made up of just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but structurally they look very, very different. Whereas your basic monosaccharide or your basic glucose molecule is a 6-carbon sugar, often forms kind of like a, often forms like a hexagonal shape. When you look at lipids, they often tend to form long carbon-hydrogen repeating chains, and this makes them what we call nonpolar. Nonpolar molecules are molecules that are very symmetrical. That means no matter which way you cut them, they create almost a mirror image of themselves, and that makes them insoluble in water. So polar molecules like to dissolve in water. Water itself is polar. Nonpolar molecules like oils and fats and the like, they are very symmetrical and they're insoluble in water. Anyone who's done the dishes knows this. Anyone who's cooked in a pan with some water and put oil in it knows this. When you put oil in a pan that has a little bit of water, you see the oil kind of ball up. It doesn't like to mix with the water, and this is the reason why. Chemically, their hydrogen bonding structure is just different. They don't like to mix with molecules that hydrogen bond, such as water. Again, it's proper to call them lipids, but often we commonly refer to them as fats. And usually when people are talking about nutrition and they talk about fats, they mean to be talking about lipids as a whole. It's not just the fats. And like I list here, there's 3 major forms that our lipids take. The fats are a specific group of lipids that are solid at room temperature. They tend to be saturated. There's a couple exceptions of this, which I'll talk about in a minute. But our saturated fats are things like, butter, lard, when you think of like a lot of the different cooking lards that we use, those things that are solid at room temperature, that's what we consider a fat. Our oils, these are things like your canola oils, your olive oils, these are your vegetable oils. These are typically your plant fats. These guys are liquid at room temperature, and they are what we call unsaturated. And we'll talk about the difference between saturated versus unsaturated in a minute. And again, there are a couple exceptions to this, and I don't really emphasize that a lot in this class. Some of you that are in the culinary arts area will explore this a little bit more. If you do a lot of cooking, you may say, well, wait a second, Mary, that's not true, or that's, there's a couple examples of some oils that are actually saturated. Some of the coconut oils or the palm oils, you'll see that they have some saturated qualities. So there's a couple exceptions to that rule, so I just wanted to note that here. But for the purposes of this general nutrition class, just remember that in general, the saturated fats are solid at room temperature, and these are things like butter and lard. And in general, the unsaturated fats, our plant fats, our plant lipids are in the category of oils, and they are liquid at room temperature. The third major form of our lipids are our cholesterols, or our sterile compounds. And these guys have a ring structure. Again, they're very nonpolar. They don't like to mix with water, but they take a very different structural form, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. So what is the major function of lipids in the body? Well, we already know that lipids deliver more than double the energy of proteins or carbohydrates. So you can see very quickly how too much fat in your diet can quickly become problematic, and we see that in the United States a lot. If you're not using those extra fats, you store them. And it's good to have some stores of fat. They're very, very important for long-term health, body function, and when times are tough. We as a society consume way too much of them. But again, pound for pound, because they do store more than twice the amount of energy that carbs or proteins do, they do make the ideal storage form of energy. So one of their major functions is to be our main store of energy in our body. So when looking at the energy in fat, again, about 9 kilocalories per gram of energy are found in fats, and that works out to be about 3,500 kilocalories or calories per pound. So if you want to burn a pound of fat, you need to burn about 3,500 calories of energy to eliminate that pound. Most adults need approximately 20% of their daily energy from fat. So again, most of your typical daily use energy is going to come from your carbs, a little bit from fat, but really pound for pound, it's the ideal storage form of energy, and so we tend to use lipids as our major way of storage of energy. And then there's also some other functions too. And that's why it's important that when we look at nutrition that we not say, well, if fats and lipids and oils, if they're what's making me fat, or if they're what's most likely contributing to my obesity or my being overweight, I'll just eliminate them from my diet. It's not that simple either, because there are so many other important uses of lipids and oils and fats in our body. They're not just an energy source. So to say, well, I'm just going to completely get rid of them is not going to work either. And you have to be very specific about what types of fats you eat too. There's some very important roles in eye and brain development, hormonal regulation, so you can't just disregard all fats. It's just important to watch them more probably than any other category of nutrient. 3 major classes of fats: triglycerides, phospholipids, and the sterol compounds again. The triglycerides, they account for approximately 95% of all of our lipids. So the vast majority of the lipids that we consume and the vast majority of the lipids that actually make up the fat in our human body, or what we think of as fat, are triglycerides. Triglycerides are also something that can be circulating in your blood, and doctors will look at that as a level of a measurement of health as well. Phospholipids, just like the name says, they have a phosphate group and they have a lipid group that make up their structure, and they are very important when we look at structural components of the cell membrane. If you think back to any sort of basic general biology course you may have had in high school, or if you've had one in college, the phospholipid bilayer is the major structural component of our cell membrane, and that helps to regulate what goes in and out of the cells. So phospholipids are very important in our cellular structure. And then, of course, again, the sterols, the cholesterols, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone are the major sterol or ring compounds that make up our sex hormones. So when you think of all the regulation of sexual functions in your body, from developing secondary sexual characteristics, developing a menstrual cycle, production of sperm, all of those things, our hormones regulate that. And if we don't have these basic sterol lipids to make those molecules, the testosterone and the estrogen, our reproductive system won't function properly. So very important for that function. So a little bit more detail on each of these groups. Triglycerides, if you look at the name triglyceride, break it down. Tri means 3, and glyceride refers to the glycerol group. Tri refers to 3 fatty acid tails, and then they have a glycerol backbone. So when you look at the basic structure of a triglyceride, you see over here that you have this glycerol backbone, and this 1, 2, 3 here, this is made up of a carbon backbone that attaches to other carbons here that are also attached and saturated with hydrogens on them. So these little tails here, these are what we call fatty acid tails, and they're just repeating carbon-hydrogen units. So you have carbon, 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 and it's surrounded by hydrogens. So you see this basic structure for all of your triglycerides. Some of them are different because the lengths of their fatty acids are different, but they all have that same basic structure. This is where we hear about the saturated and the unsaturated, this is where they come in. When we look at the carbon-carbon the carbon-carbon bonding that goes on here, carbon needs to form 4 bonds to be complete, to have its outer electron shell filled. It can do that in several different ways. When you look at these carbons, these little balls that represent carbon, they're bonded to the carbons next to them. That fills 2 of the bonds. If it is a saturated fat, you'll have the bonds to the carbons next to you, and then it's not drawn on here, but there will also be 2 bonds going out laterally to hydrogens. And if you have complete saturation of your fatty acid with hydrogens, we call that a saturated fatty acid. So if all of those extra bonds are saturated with hydrogen, it's called a saturated fatty acid. Sometimes the carbon will double bond with the carbon next to it. We call that a point of unsaturation. So when you see this carbon-carbon double bonding, that's a point of unsaturation. So that means that this lipid here is not fully saturated with hydrogen, and we call that an unsaturated fat. Here, since there's only 1 point of saturation, it's called a monounsaturated fat. Here there's multiple points of unsaturation, so we call it a polyunsaturated fat. So the unsaturated fats, I'm sure you've heard this before, they tend to be better for you. They tend to be the healthier types of fats. The ones that are completely saturated, these tend to contribute more to cardiovascular disease. They tend to be more likely to get lodged in your blood vessels. So if you are consuming fats, trying to consume as many polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fats is better for you. You don't want them completely saturated with hydrogens like this. You want some double bonding in here, carbon double bonding in here. So that's where the terminology saturated versus unsaturated comes from. Phospholipids, like I mentioned, they're major structures of our cell membrane. When you look at the phospholipid, you have this phosphate group on one end, and then you have these lipid tails. And that phosphate group on the end here is very polar. Again, that likes water, where the nonpolar tails, they do not like water. So phospholipids, by creating this bilayer where you have these phosphate heads sticking out and inside the cell membrane, that creates a water base inside the cell and allows the cell to be in a water base, but creates this middle region here that's very hydrophobic. Again, hydrophobic means water-fearing. Think of claustrophobic. People who are claustrophobic don't like small spaces. If you're hydrophobic, you don't like water. Hydrophilic means water-loving. So these edges out here are more hydrophilic, and the center region here is more hydrophobic. So that really allows for the cell membrane to help regulate what passes through here. The only things that can freely pass across the cell membrane are things that are extremely small and that don't mind mixing with lipids. So things like gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide can freely diffuse through the cell membrane. But things that are bigger or things that like to be dissolved in water, they don't like to go through here. They can still cross, but they have to go through gated channels or regulated channels. So things like glucose, different ions, sodium, potassium, amino acids, they can cross the cell membrane, but they have to go through regulated channels, which this allows that characteristic of our cell membrane to regulate its internal environment and respond to the environment outside of it. This is a typical depiction of what we call the fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane. You can see here all these little red heads, these red balls are those phosphate groups, and the little lipid tails, these little lipid tails are facing each other, and you can see how dynamic the cell membrane is. You can see there's all these embedded channels or pathways, different protein molecules. There's some carbohydrate chains that are attached to some different proteins. We call those glycoproteins. Some carbohydrate chains are attached to lipids. We call those glycolipids. Glyco refers to the sugar component, and the lipid refers to the lipid component. So you see all sorts of different recognition molecules, regulation molecules, receptor molecules, all embedded in this phospholipid bilayer that allows the cell to communicate with the outside world and also regulate what goes in and out of it. And on that note too, so you've got the phospholipid bilayer, when you see this glycolipid here, again, it has a sugar component and it also has a lipid component. A lot of these glycolipids and glycoproteins as well are used as recognition molecules so that cells know who they're next to, so they can know who they're working with, or if they're maybe next to a bacteria or virus, so that our immune system will get stimulated to engulf that and get rid of it. So glycolipids and glycoproteins play huge roles in recognizing recognition of self and recognition of foreign antigens. And in that third group again, so we've got the triglycerides, we've got the phospholipids, that last group, The sterols, again, these guys have a very unique structure to them. You can see they create these, each of these points here on all these different hexagons and pentagons and whatnot. That's a site of a carbon-carbon double bonding going on. You can see hydrogens are coming off different methyl groups. A very unique structure of a lipid. Again, it is a lipid because it's just made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It is nonpolar, doesn't like to dissolve in water easily. So it falls in that category, but a very unique group because of this ring structure that it has. This is an example of cholesterol, and this is the basic. If you look at testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, they all have the same basic structure. You'll see some of these side groups might look a little bit different, but they all have the same kind of sterile ring structure. So in that group, again, you have all your sex hormones, which regulate sexual development and procreation, but also cholesterol. And cholesterol gets a bad rap. We hear all the time about how bad cholesterol is for you, and you've got to watch your cholesterol numbers. That is true, but cholesterol is a very important molecule. It's just that it's dangerous in high quantities. We tend to consume too much of it. But we absolutely need it. It helps us with making bile. It helps us with recycling different lipoproteins. It helps with cell membrane structure. It's a component of our cell membranes. It also helps with vitamin D processing too. So cholesterol has a lot of very important roles that get overlooked. Again, it's just important to keep it in check because high levels of cholesterol can result in cardiovascular disease. So some other functions of lipids. We mentioned how it functions to store long-term energy storage, how it helps with not only energy but also hormone balance and also cellular structure. But there's some other really important roles it plays. Cushion. It's think about the places where we tend to store our fat. We tend to store it in our butts, in the back of our thighs, and in our legs. It helps so like when we're a little baby learning how to walk, that we fall down on that butt. It's nice and cushiony. There's lots of little fat pads that surround our heart and our visceral organs or our digestive system organs, and that helps to absorb shock if we were ever to get in a car accident or fall down. Fat is a great cushiony molecule that helps to protect our vital organs. Fat pads under the skin also help to insulate the body from extremes of temperature. So fat helps keep you warm. It's a great insulator. A lot of us don't like that fat right under our skin. That subcutaneous fat gives us that dimply look, and you can see that show up as cellulite on your legs, which is never a fun, aesthetically pleasing look, but it does help to keep us warm. Nutrient absorption. Several of our vitamins, which we'll talk about in another unit, vitamins A, D, E, and K, these are all what we call fat-soluble vitamins. They do not dissolve freely in water. They need to be dissolved in fat. So they also, because of that, foods that tend to have fat are the ones where we get these vitamins. So if you're going to consume fat-soluble vitamins, you have to consume foods that have fat in them to get those vitamins. So, things like, believe it or not, mayonnaise has tons of vitamin E. So when you look at a lot of these vitamins, you see them in foods that tend to have some fat components. Not all of them. I mean, you can find vitamin A in carrots and vitamin K in a lot of your green leafy vegetables, which don't tend to be high fat foods. Yet, like I said, a lot of oils, a lot of the salad oils and dressings and mayonnaise, you tend to see a lot of these vitamins in there as well. The central nervous system, another function of lipids, is to help make what's called the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is essentially a highly fatty component of cells that wrap around your nerve cells. And the myelin sheath really, what it does is it by insulating what's called the axon of your nerve cell, it allows for that nerve impulse to jump over parts of the axon and travel more quickly. So myelinated nerve cells actually send quicker nerve impulses than the non-myelinated ones. A lot of you have probably heard of white matter and gray matter in discussing the brain and the spinal column. The white matter and gray matter, the reason we call it white matter versus gray matter, The white matter is made up of myelinated nerve cells, whereas the gray matter is part of your nervous system that's made up of non-myelinated nerve cells. The myelinated nerve cells are white like that. They have that white look to them because of the high fat content or the high lipid content. And that's very important for proper nerve function. So believe it or not, you actually need quite a bit of lipids to help make your nervous system function properly. So being short on certain lipids can be very hard to your nervous system health. And then there are some essential fatty acids, and some of these actually are linked to the nervous system, but there's some fatty acids where our body can't make them. Lots of times our body can consume certain types of fatty acids and then convert them into fatty acids that it would need to do certain functions. But there are some elements that are just not convertible. We can't, and you see this word essential used a lot when we talk about those essential fatty acids, essential amino acids. Some of these essential nutrients are called essential because we need to consume them in their raw form. We can't take other raw materials and convert them into these building blocks. So a lot of your omega-3s and your omega-6 fatty acids, a lot of the DHA supplements, those have fatty acids that our body doesn't have the ability to make them, so we have to consume them from an outside source. So again, glycogen is not the major form of energy storage. We talked about glycogen with the carbohydrate unit. Yes, glycogen is a very important storage molecule, but really it's just a bridge between meals for us. It allows us to go, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours without consuming any calories and not feel hungry. After about 4 to 6 hours, we all feel it. We all feel that we start to feel hungry, and that's because our glycogen stores have been depleted. So really, glycogen is not a way to store energy for the long term. And when I'm talking about long term, I'm talking about days and weeks and not just hours. So glycogen is really short-term energy storage. It's a very heavy, bulky molecule. It's highly branched, holds a lot of water. So it's not an efficient way to store energy long term. Whereas fat is very efficient. It has more than 2 times the amount of energy as carbohydrates. It's highly packed. It's stored in specialized tissue called adipose tissue, that's its function. Its function is to store fat. So it's very good at what it does. So again, most body cells only store a limited amount of fat. So we have these specialized cells, and even this adipose tissue actually will secrete certain hormones and enzymes that influence food intake and affect the body's use of certain nutrients. We'll talk about leptin and ghrelin, which are hormones released by the stomach and by the fat tissue, respectively. They help regulate the sensations of being full and being hungry. And so the amount of body fat that you have should influence those hunger reflexes or that satiation or feeling of being satisfied. Here I have this picture. This isn't in your book, but I just like to show this picture because it really depicts well how body tissues look different. I believe it was the unit on the physiology of the body. We talked a little bit about how cells work together to make a tissue and how tissues work together to make an organ, how organs work together to make an organ system. And they all, again, all of these cells, they're all body cells that all have the same genetic code, but they all function very differently. They all turn on different genes and leave other genes turned off so that they can do certain body functions. They all specialize into special roles. So even though genetically these tissues are exactly the same, you can see here how different they look. On the left, you have muscle tissue, which here, these big dark dots here, those are the nuclei of cells. So you have the nuclei of the cells that are kind of being pushed aside, and you almost have like this kind of salmon fillet look to the tissue here. Well, within these cells, you have lots of fibrous structures laid down, a lot of actin, myosin, filaments, because the job of this tissue is to contract. So you have a lot of contractual fibers that are laid down that work together to perform a function, which is movement. Whereas over here, the nuclei are very hard to see, and you see these little dark dots. Literally, this is an outline of a cell, and the job of this cell, or these cells within this tissue, is to store fat. And they do such a good job of it that you really can't see any other structures. The one structure you can kind of see is the nucleus that gets pushed off to the side, but even that is very hard to depict. So again, they have all the same basic components. They all have a nucleus. They all have different organelles. But because of their job, because of their specialty, they look very, very different. And these fat cells have a very kind of whitish quality to them because within the cell, their major function is to store fat, and fat's kind of a whitish yellow color. So all of these cells are quite laid down with fat. And if you look at another thing about these tissues that's so different, look how red and rich this tissue looks. It's much more vascularized, has a better blood supply because it constantly needs an energy supply since these tissues are always contracting. Over here you can see a couple blood vessels, but adipose tissue doesn't tend to be highly vascular. It's a very slow metabolic tissue. Again, its function is to store energy. So by nature, it doesn't use a lot of energy. So it's a very metabolically lazy tissue. Whereas muscle tissue, its job is to contract and move and beat the heart or move the skeletal muscles. So it's a very metabolically expensive tissue. This is why people who tend to be more lean, tend to have more lean muscle versus fat, they tend to have a higher metabolism. You can have two people of the exact same weight, but if you have more lean muscle mass versus fat, you're going to burn calories at a higher rate. Some of those essential fatty acids that I mentioned, they're very closely spelled here, linoleic and linolenic acid. Most of you commonly know them as the omega-6 and the omega-3 fatty acids. Don't worry so much about getting these mixed up on a test. I'm not going to ask you specifically to separate and identify these. I just want you to know that these acids, these omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, are essential because we can't make them, or we just can't make them in large enough quantities. They're very common in fish oils, a lot of different seafoods, krill, flaxseed oils, different nuts, and some grains will have them. So you do get these in flaxseed. Some, I think, almonds are pretty high in as well. A lot of the different fish will have a lot of these different acids, these fatty acids. Very, very important for brain development, vision and hearing development, immune system function. And again, since we're doing a lot of our brain development while we're still a fetus, a lot of women will be put on omega-6, omega-3 fatty acid supplements as part of their prenatal vitamin supplements because those stages of brain development are so important, and you never get that window of opportunity open again. So a lot of them are sold as omega-6, omega-3 fatty acid supplements, or sometimes you'll see them in the store listed as DHA supplements. It's a little bit more specific about the type of name of the fatty acids. But if you're ever in a Target or a Walmart or a Walgreens, you'll see those in the vitamins section, and that's what they're referring to. So looking at how we process fats, how do we digest and absorb them? Again, I mentioned before that really in the mouth, there's an enzyme that infants produce to digest the milk fat, but really we don't really see a lot of fat digestion in the mouth once we become an adult. So really in the mouth, not much is being processed. It's mainly just mechanical digestion, just chewing the food. In the stomach, when you see the chyme develop, you really see the fat separate away from the watery components of food. You get this thicky mash food or chyme, and the fat will tend to kind of float up towards the top. Fat is less dense than water, so it will separate from the water and then float on the top of the chyme in the stomach. In the small intestine, that first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, again, so far we haven't really seen any fat digestion. And again, the fat doesn't like to mix with water. So you're going to see it really separate away from the watery components. But once we get to the small intestine, the duodenum will receive bile from the gallbladder to emulsify the fats. And this is what you see in your kitchen again when you have an oily pan that has water on it. You see the oil and the water, they separate. They don't like to mix. And it's really hard to scrub off that sticky grease off of a pan unless you have soap. Soap is an emulsifier, just like bile. It allows water and fat to mix. And so it has both qualities of being hydrophobic and hydrophilic, so that it allows those fats to get emulsified or mixed up. And that's exactly what the bile does. The bile, again, which is stored in your gallbladder, it's made by your liver, but it's stored in your gallbladder. When you have a highly fatty meal, there'll be a hormone signal to the gallbladder to release that bile into that first part of the small intestine, so the fats get emulsified, so enzymes can get in there and start digesting them. Again, if you have no gallbladder, that doesn't mean you can't consume or process fats. In fact, you still have to. The challenge here is just that the liver will produce the bile, and the doctors will reroute it if you've had gallbladder surgery, so that the bile just continuously gets delivered to the small intestine. But if you don't have that gallbladder, you really have to eat small amounts of fat at a time. If you eat really highly fatty meals, you'll get very, very nauseated. I've had many students in the past testify to this in class, that if they eat a highly fatty meal, they'll get really sick. They'll even start vomiting. They'll have really loose, fatty stools. They just don't even want to try it because it's such a painful experience. So be very aware if you have gallbladder surgery that you've got to limit your fat at any given time. So in that small intestine, those fats get split into smaller particles for absorption. So your triglycerides tend to get split into fatty acids and glycerol. So you have all of these triglycerides and other fats that get broken down into their smaller components. Once they're small enough, they can get absorbed across the intestinal wall, but you do need some help shuttling that. The bile will help shuttle the lipids across the mucus layer into those absorptive cells in the intestine, but once some of that bile may be reabsorbed and reused, but sometimes it will exit in the feces. If you ever notice in your bowel movements, if you ever see something that looks kind of stringy, mucusy, almost within your fecal matter, and it might kind of look green or yellowish, and you might be like, wow, what's that? What did I eat for lunch? It kind of scares you a little bit to see almost like a big mucus glob stretching through your fecal matter. That's bile when you see that. So don't panic when you see that, or take notice next time you go to the bathroom. You may be like, oh yeah, now I know what that is. So if you ever see that, that is bile that's being exited through the fecal matter, but it can be reabsorbed and reused. But once it starts to get absorbed by those cells of the intestinal wall, how does it get into the bloodstream? Again, lipids, they do not like to mix with water. So again, your blood is water-based. So how do you get lipids traveling through a water-based bloodstream to get to the tissues where they're used? Well, we have things that are called lipoproteins, which essentially what happens is you have a protein that will bind to the lipids that you've consumed and create these molecules called lipoproteins. And by creating a lipoprotein, this allows that lipid portion to be transported in the blood and in the lymph. There's 4 major classes of lipoproteins. There's chylomicrons, VLDLs, LDLs, and HDLs. And the ones I want you to really know for the test, are your LDLs and your HDLs. I mentioned VLDLs and chylomicrons here because if you go on in nutrition, I wouldn't have done my duty if I hadn't mentioned them. But for the purposes of most people's studies and what you hear of the most and the ones you need to worry about the most, it's really the LDLs and the HDLs that you hear about the most and that you have to be the most concerned about. If you go on in nutrition, you'll study the other ones a little bit more too. But those are the 2 major classes of lipoproteins I want you to know. And so LDLs and HDLs, what do these stand for and what do they do? LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. That's what the name stands for. HDL stand for high density lipoproteins. So the role of low density lipoproteins, their job is to transport cholesterol and other lipids to body tissues. Basically, the VLDLs, that stands for very low density lipoproteins, they are combined to make the LDL. So VLDLs basically make LDLs. These LDLs are what most of us think of as the bad cholesterol. A lot of people have heard of, well, my good cholesterol versus my bad cholesterol, and they look at their numbers from their doctor, and their doctor will usually just refer to them as the good or the bad cholesterol. When you talk about bad cholesterol, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about low density lipoproteins. Low density, they're low density, that means they tend to be bulkier. They tend to get lodged in your vessels, and the lodging in the vessels causes what we call plaques, which are these hard, crusty linings inside your vessels, which limit the passageway between your vessels and also harden your arteries. They make it, they take away the elasticity of your arteries. So they do two terrible things: narrow the passageway and also make the passageway less elastic, which contributes to the chances for high blood pressure, blockage, stroke, all sorts of problems. So your LDLs, again, they are important. You do need them to help deliver certain lipids and cholesterol to body tissues, but high levels of these can cause problems. They will get lodged and cause plaques. The high density lipoproteins, or the HDLs, just like the name says, they're high density. So they tend to be more dense, tightly packed, and smaller, so they tend to be less likely to get lodged in vessels. And their job is really to be scavengers. They go around and they pick up excess cholesterol and phospholipids from the tissues, and essentially they take them back to the liver, and the liver will recycle them. The liver actually makes some cholesterol and recycles some old cholesterol. So the liver plays a huge role in helping us regulate our cholesterol and our lipoproteins. So the HDLs, these guys are known as our good cholesterol because their job is to clean up the vessels. So how did I remember this? Because I, like you, was like, man, how am I going to keep these guys straight? I always think of my blood vessels as a major highway system, and the blood inside it are the cars. And that's essentially what it is. Your circulatory system is just a major transport system, and you have components within that transport system that have to get from point A to point B, and they use your veins and your arteries to get there. So your LDLs, the way I would remember this was, my LDLs are my low-down litterers. These are the people that throw junk out of their cars and leave it in the ditches and the roads. These are the plaques. So all the garbage you see in the ditches along the sides of the highway, those are the plaques. So LDLs, these are my low-down litterers that destroy the highway system. Whereas my HDLs, these are my adopt-a-highway heroes. So think of highway, like those adopt-a-highway signs on the side of the road, those people that are kind enough to clean up the highways. They're the ones out there picking up the trash so that everything can still get through. Imagine if we never cleaned up our highways and we just let the trash build up and build up and build up. Eventually, we would have an artery clog. Eventually, that highway would be jammed and nothing could get through. So think of it in terms of a highway system, and that's how I always would keep it straight. LDLs are my litterers, HDLs are my highway heroes. If you have more LDLs than you have HDLs, you're going to clog your roads. So it's your LDLs you want to keep low, and your HDLs you want to keep high. That's how we look at risk for cardiovascular diseases. So again, lipoproteins and the heart disease risk, it's a huge factor when we look at your chances of different forms of cardiovascular or heart disease. So risk factors for heart disease, if you have high blood LDLs, again, these are the bad guys. You don't want these high. And low blood HDLs, again, these are your good guys. You don't want them low, you want them high. So if you have these out of whack, that's a huge risk factor for heart disease. High blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, physical activity, cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking is known to contribute to capillary damage and hardening of your arteries. And an atherogenic diet, which atherogenic diet just means a high-fat diet. A lot of big fat steaks and a lot of burgers, a lot of highly fatty meat. Again, all things in moderation. Not that those things are bad for you, but if your diet never consists of any fruits and veggies and it's all highly fatty meats, that's not a good sign. So when you look at your heart disease risk, you can't control your age, you can't control your gender, you can't control your genetics. And we do know that age, gender, and genetics do play a role in heart disease risk. But you can control your diet, how much you exercise, if you smoke or not, and your weight. And we know that these also play a huge role. So there's a lot of things you can do to help reduce your heart disease risk. I had a very good friend and colleague who his dad had died in his 30s. So he grew up not really knowing his dad very well, but he knows now that he's at a very high genetic predisposition for heart disease because his dad died so young. And sure enough, he himself, who was of a good weight, just naturally his genetics make it hard for him to control his cholesterol. His cholesterol is very high, and he himself had a heart attack in his 30s. So there are things that you just cannot control, but now he's more aware of it, and he just has a much stricter diet, and he knew the warning signs right away when he had the heart attack. He knew his family history, And so he got treatment right away, and he survived the heart attack, and today he's doing very well. But you can't control for these things, but you can absolutely control for these things. And knowledge of your genetics and your condition can contribute to how much exercise you do and how much you control your diet to help try and stave off the effects of those genetics. Another reason why diet and exercise are so important, when you look at the bad cholesterol, when you look at trying to lower your LDLs, that's very much linked to diet. You want to cut what are called trans fatty acids and saturated fats, and just your overall cholesterol intake. And we'll talk about trans fatty acids in a minute. But diet is absolutely linked to those bad cholesterol numbers. However, HDLs, our good guys, our adaptive highway folks, they are exercise related. Again, remember I mentioned that the liver is involved in cholesterol and lipid synthesis. The liver actually makes our good cholesterol, and the making of HDLs is stimulated by physical activity. So another reason why not only diet but exercise is so important in your health. Again, I will say it with just about every unit as we talk about nutrition. If you want to be in good health, it's not enough just to say, well, I'm going to eat right, but I hate working out, or I hate going to the gym, or I hate stretching, or I hate running, or I hate swimming. You gotta find some forms of exercise that you enjoy. You have to have an active lifestyle, because it isn't as simple as saying, I'm not going to exercise and that'll be enough. To make your good cholesterol, which helps keep your overall cholesterol in check, you have to be physically active, because that is what stimulates the liver to make those HDLs. And here's just a depiction. This isn't in the book, but you can see these pictures just about anywhere in any sort of health textbook. When you look at, this is a cross-section of a blood vessel, you can see the atherosclerosis. That refers to that plaque buildup, hardening of the arteries. You have a vessel that's lined by smooth muscle, which is it can contract and expand pretty easily. But once you start getting these plaque buildups, that really takes away the elasticity of that vessel to expand and contract. And also you can see it's really narrowing that passageway. And eventually you can have these plaques build up enough to where they actually block the passageway or cause a blood clot that might get stuck behind here to break off and go plug somewhere else and cause a stroke or a pulmonary embolism or something like that. So what do we do when we see these clogs in our arteries? Well, a lot of you have heard of bypass surgery, probably heard of double bypass, triple bypass. It literally, again, think of like a highway. If there's a car accident on the highway and you can't get through that route, you bypass it. You take an alternate route. And that's exactly what they do when they do coronary bypass surgery. Usually what they do is they take a vein from a leg, and they'll take that segment out and they'll reroute blood from this major vessel here. This curved red vessel is called the aorta. This is the major artery leaving the vein, which goes out and feeds the body. They'll actually use a vessel from the leg to route some blood back to the heart and bypass where this blockage is. So here you can see this little blockage here. When you hear about people having a heart attack, or the proper name is myocardial infarction, that's the fancy name for a heart attack, a myocardial infarction. What they're actually having when they have a heart attack is these vessels that feed the heart here, you can see all these red and blue vessels. These are the coronary arteries and coronary veins. And their job is to feed the heart a blood supply and then take it literally back to the heart to be recirculated again and go to the lungs and get more oxygen and whatnot. So just like any other tissue in the body, any other muscle or any other area, the heart has to be fed a blood supply. And the coronary arteries and veins feed that blood supply to the heart. So if there's a blockage in one of those vessels, all this area that was fed by that vessel is now starting to die. And so when somebody starts to feel chest pain, what they're feeling is the results of that blockage, and that can slow down heart function or maybe even stop it. So when you have this blockage, sometimes you'll do a bypass surgery like this. If you just do one bypass, it's called a bypass. But if you have multiple sites of blockage, you might have a double or triple or even a quadruple bypass. So depending on the places of blockage, you may have more bypasses. Also, sometimes, I can't remember if I have a slide on it. Nope, I don't. Sometimes what they can do is they can go in here and put a balloon in. They'll run a wire called a catheter in there to help break up that clot or expand it. Oops. Expand it, or they'll put what's called a stent in there. So you may have heard of that before. If somebody gets a stent in there, they'll put, it's like a little, usually it's a little metal mesh that once they get it in there, they will expand it to open that vessel wider to allow blood to go through. So those are some different ways that you can treat a victim of a heart attack or help stave off the chances of a heart attack. So that's what we're referring to when we talk about those plaques building up. So I give you a little bit of data here, and this is actually, these are actually my lab results from when I went to the doctor back in August. You can see the date there, August 17th of 2011. Yes, I'm getting to be an old fart now, and once you hit a certain age, which I will not disclose, but once you hit a certain age, they start to check your cholesterol every year. There's nothing that makes you feel older than your first doctor's appointment where they check your cholesterol, but yes, I get it done every year. Fun. But I think this is important. I just kind of cut and pasted out of my lab report. I thought, I'm going to show my students my results so they can see what it shows and what that means, so that when you go someday and get these results, now you can understand what you're looking at. You get an overall cholesterol number, which is 0 to 200 milligrams per deciliter. That's referring to how many milligrams of cholesterol you have in a deciliter of fluid in your body. And you don't want it to be over 200. And you can see my number there is 184. My triglycerides are 129, and you don't want those over 150, so that's good too. Notice on the HDL cholesterol, remember I said that's your good cholesterol? Notice they actually have a minimum here. They don't want you to have less than 50. Again, it's the good cholesterol, so they actually want you to have some around. So the range for the good cholesterol is 50 to 110. And again, I'm in a good range. I'm at 62. And then your bad cholesterol, 0 to 129, you don't want a lot of this around. Mine's at 96, so I'm in a good range. And then they also show my VLDL cholesterol, and that's just to show, that's just to show, again, those are the building blocks of my LDLs, so they show that number as well. Then the cholesterol to HDL ratio. Again, you 0 to 5 is the range on that. And again, the HDL number, you can see in this ratio, your HDL is the bottom number. So the higher your good cholesterol, the lower that overall ratio is going to be. So you can see they don't want that ratio to be higher than 5. So that's an indicator of overall health. So if your cholesterol happens to be low, which is a good thing, but your HDLs are too low too, that might give you a skewed ratio here. So the doctors might be like, hey, you're doing a good job keeping your cholesterol down, but you need to get your good cholesterol up. So you need to exercise a little bit more. And then, of course, I had a glucose screening, too, and you can see my glucose numbers were fine. I'm at 89, and you shouldn't be up above 100 there, above 99. So now you know how to read your report the next time you go to the doctor. So things to stay away from. Hydrogenated oils. Let's talk a little bit about hydrogenated oils and trans fatty acids, because you see these a lot in processed foods. We all tend to run into these. Hydrogenated oils are oils that were initially unsaturated, that means they had a lot of those carbon-carbon double bonds. They weren't completely saturated with hydrogen. So what the manufacturer did was they hydrogenated them artificially by chemically breaking that extra double bond and replacing those bonds with hydrogen. They don't do this because they hate you. They don't do this to be mean. Yes, they are bad for you, but manufacturers aren't really truly out to get you. They actually have practical reasons why they do this. It makes the oils a lot safer. They're less likely to start a fire, and if you've ever seen a grease fire, you know what I mean. Grease fires are very dangerous. The oils, if you do what's called increase the smoking point, again, that's the point at which oils begin to burn, you can greatly reduce your chances of a kitchen fire. And if you think of all of your restaurants and your fast food joints, they all have these huge vats of grease and oils for which they fry foods. So they tend to use these hydrogenated oils because they can get to a higher temperature without catching on fire. So it's a safety measure. It also increases their shelf life because it makes them more resistant to what we call oxidation. So they're less likely to go rancid or to go bad quickly. So that's going to make them cheaper to produce. If a product can last longer and is less likely to cause a safety hazard, it makes it cheaper to mass produce. So these tend to be the way people make their oils because you can get more of the product for less money. So essentially it artificially saturates our oils and it makes them worse for us. So whenever you eat fried food, chances are it's been cooked in what we call hydrogenated oils. Lots of times on the back of packaging you'll see it'll say partially hydrogenated soybean oil. That's what we're talking about here. Anytime you see partially hydrogenated oil, soybean oil, canola oil, any of those partially hydrogenated olive oil, usually it's soybean oil that they use. That is a sign of foods that have been hydrogenated or oils that have been hydrogenated, and they're typically worse for you. So lots of fast food, greasy places, lots of cake frostings, a lot of that kind of stuff. A lot of different candies have hydrogenated oils in them, so try to stay away from those. The process of hydrogenating the oils, not only does it make them more saturated, it also creates a byproduct called trans fatty acids. Trans fatty acids are actually still they still have their carbon-carbon double bonding, but a trans fatty acid actually creates an extra kink in the chain of the fatty acid. And again, this is an artificial byproduct of hydrogenation of oils. And we have no way to break them down. We really don't have a way to process them. They're not a natural product you see in the environment. So when you create this artificial byproduct of hydrogenating oils, it makes it very hard for your body to get rid of it. And so they tend to stick in your vessels, and they tend to very easily contribute to plaque buildup. So stay away from those hydrogenated oils, stay away from those trans fatty acids. The DRI actually recommends that you consume 0 grams a day. There is no DRI recommendation for these because they're so bad for you. So again, trans fatty acids are known to cause inflammation in your vessels. Again, it's like an irritant that's stuck in there and you just can't get rid of it. They cause inflammation. They contribute to heart disease. They raise your bad cholesterols, and there's no nutrient value to them. There's no good that comes from them. So stay away from those. And again, where do we see these? We tend to see our saturated fats tend to be any real fatty meat, any pork, butter, lard, any domestic cow type products. They tend to be more fatty. Anything cooked in butter, lard, or hydrogenated oils tend to be high in saturated fats. And again, your fried foods, I say here, insert your fast food restaurant of choice. Most of them cook with hydrogenated oils. Some of them are starting to get away from that, and then they advertise it as well. They tell you that there's no trans fatty acid, which is good. It makes them not as bad for you, but they still have a very high fat content. Anything from the state fair, anything from the Renaissance Festival, anything from the carnival, really anything that's breaded and deep fried is no good. I know, I'm sorry, it's depressing to hear that, but there's very little nutrient value to anything breaded and deep fried. I know they always taste so good, don't they? But do your best to keep those as limited products in your diet because there's very little nutrient value that you get for the high level of cost to consuming that. The last thing, I think this is my last. The last thing I wanted to mention here. This is my last slide. It's kind of new in the news, and I guess it's been out for a few years now. But I do like to address some of these the things that you see on the shelf in the grocery store. So there's always something that comes out, and I've got to go figure out what they're doing now. There's a drug out called Ally. It's been advertised on TV, and you see it in the pharmacy section at your big box stores and at your Walgreens and your CVS stores. Ally is a diet supplement. It is FDA approved, and again, the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, so they've done some clinical trials on it, so they've found it to be relatively safe. What it does is Ally limits the amount of fat that can actually cross the small intestine. A few years ago, it's getting to be quite a few years ago, probably over a decade ago now, there was a similar compound used in potato chips called Alestra. Some of you might remember that. It's not as popular anymore because well, frankly, the chips didn't taste very good, I don't think, but that kind of fizzled quickly. But Olestra was a similar compound that was used in potato chips to try and limit the amount of fat absorption. So you need to stop and think about what's that doing. So if you're taking a drug that limits the amount of fat that can cross from the small intestine into your bloodstream, you're going to have a whole bunch of lipids or fats in your intestinal system that are not getting absorbed, and they got to go somewhere. And so they tend to cause a lot of abdominal cramping and pain. A lot of people who take these drugs tend to complain about diarrhea. I actually know somebody who tried this medication. I always have one friend I can refer to on these crazy diet things. And she told me about how she would have anal leakage. Yummy, doesn't that sound good? Again, the fat has to go somewhere. And she would describe it as almost like taco grease or pizza grease. That, if she had to go to the bathroom really bad, she would have this fatty anal leakage come out. And she'd have to be running to the bathroom all the time with this really runny, greasy diarrhea. Yuck, I just can't imagine. But everyone's got to try their own things. I believe in freedom of choice, and everyone's got to learn their own way. So if you want to give her a try, it absolutely does help with weight loss. But even when you read the disclaimers on it, it tells you should limit the amount of fat in your diet, because if you consume too much fat, it's going to give you all these side effects. Well, why not just save the money and limit the fat anyway? Because if you limit the fat anyway, you will lose weight that way too. So save your money and limit your fat intake, and you don't have to deal with those side effects. So maybe you have to limit a little bit more fat than you'd like to, but the health benefits will be well worth it. And you'll save, boy, I don't know, I think it costs like $85 a month or $65 a month. It's quite a bit of money. That's not cheap, and to consider that you'd have to do that the rest of your life, that's a big investment. And I just can't see it being healthy your whole life. So again, it is FDA approved. It is found to be relatively safe, and it absolutely can help you lose weight. But I think sticking by the old staples of good diet and exercise might be the most effective way, especially long term, and just in how you feel, to try and lose weight. So that's what Ally is, if you ever wondered before. And so give it a try if you like, but believe me, from the person I know who tried it, she had nothing but regret after that first trip to the bathroom.